Thanks so much for joining us, everyone, whether you're joining us on our Zoom webinar, whether you're joining us on Facebook Live. Really appreciate your time tonight. My name is Rashid Clark. I'm the marketing specialist at the Riverwood Conservancy. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're staying safe. Thank you for joining us tonight from wherever you are. And thank you to Credit Valley Conservation for their support in making this webinar possible. Learn more about their tremendous work at cvc.ca. And if you'd like to support our environmental work both in Riverwood and I guess around the world virtually through events like this, we'd very much appreciate a donation to keep events like this going strong. And you can give your gift at theriverwoodconservancy.org. And before we get into the presentation, just a couple of notes to pass your way. We are broadcasting this webinar both on Zoom and on our Facebook page. If you're watching us on Zoom and you have a question at any point throughout the presentation, please enter it in the Q&A tab in Zoom. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, you can leave a question in the comment section. We'll get to as many as we can tonight. And just keep in mind, there is a little bit of a delay between the broadcast on Zoom and what you're seeing on Facebook. I'll be flipping back and forth between Zoom and Facebook to monitor for questions. So please bear with me as I juggle the wonders of technology here. And a little bit more about our presenter tonight, Barbara Merck, who is a geologist by training. She completed her undergraduate degree at Princeton University and her graduate degree at the University of Toronto. For the past 10 years, Professor Merck has co-taught a field course in Ecuador for the University of Toronto's Summer Abroad program, which sees students spend 1 month in the field studying geology, ecology, environmental science, and international development in the Andes, the Amazon, and the Galapagos Islands. And Professor Merck is the author of several textbooks on geology and environmental science. She's an award-winning lecturer and was a recipient of the University of Toronto's President's Teaching Award in 2010. So she's legit. That's enough for me. Barbara, I will turn things over to you.
Okay. So Rashid, is that good? Can you see my screen?
We can, and we're all set.
We always joke those are the phrases of the year. Can you see my screen? Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me now?
And you're on mute.
Yes, or you should be on mute.
Or you should be on mute. Those are the phrases of the year. Well, thanks very much for having me. I enjoy very much giving talks at Riverwood Conservancy in person. Unfortunately, we can't be there in person tonight, but it's great to know that so many of you are there and have expressed an interest in this topic. So much of an interest, I guess, Rashid, I'll just mention that we decided to continue this discussion next week with a part 2, and which actually was a big service to me, because when I launched into setting up this talk, I realized there's way too much to cover in just one session. So I'd be happy if any of you would like to join me same time next week, and we'll continue. I won't say too much about myself because Rashid already pretty much covered it. I'm from the Department of Geography, Geomatics, and Environment at the Mississauga campus of the University of Toronto, right around the corner from Riverwood. I am a geologist by training, even though I'm in a geography department. And I mostly lecture on environmental science, sustainability, natural hazards, and I have quite a big focus on international development. And as you can see from my screen here, I am a devoted hiker, even hiking in the time of COVID. So we're going to do a little poll here. Rashid is going to pull this up for us because I'm kind of curious about where you're all coming from. And I'd like to know if a lot of you have been to the islands. And so you're going to be choosing your answer here. Have you been to the islands previously? Or perhaps you haven't been, but you really are interested in going. Or maybe you're happy just exploring and discovering the islands from a distance, and that's fine as well.
Yeah, the votes are coming in. I think only a few people who are in attendance here on Zoom have not yet voted. So thanks everyone for
that was fast.
That was fast. I think they were getting to the poll even before we brought it up or prompted them to. So yeah, awesome. Really sharp audience here on Zoom. So thanks so much. And looks like just about everyone has voted, and we have about 70% of folks here who haven't been to the islands but really want to go. And then we have about 17% who have been to the Galapagos Islands, lucky you, and another 15% who are content to explore and learn from a distance, which awesome. We all kind of have to do right now anyway.
Very well, exactly. Yeah, we don't have much choice. Very happy to know where you're all coming from. And I think I have some things that I can tell all of you, even those who have been down there. Hopefully I'll be able to tell you a few new things. So as Rashid mentioned, I am privileged to teach this field course every year in Ecuador. This would have been the 16th year of the course and my 11th year, I think, teaching the course. Unfortunately, we're not able to go, so we're going to be running it virtually. We take usually around 25 University of Toronto students to Ecuador, and we go to the Amazon, the Andes, and the Galapagos Islands, and it's pretty great and it's pretty life-changing. So I've been to the Galapagos Islands probably about 12 or 13 times at this point, and it's kind of a funny place to end up going so often. Who would have thought? I love the opportunity to talk about the islands, and like I said, I hope I'm going to be able to tell you some interesting things. So I like to start with this photo, which is, of course, a photo of the islands from the International Space Station. It was tweeted from the space station by Commander Hadfield. And what you can see here, I'm just gonna hopefully try this and see if it will work. No, oh, there we go. Can you see my little laser pointer? So this big island right here, this is the biggest island in the archipelago. It's called Isabella. I always think it sort of looks like a seahorse. And then you see some of the other islands here. Some are shrouded in cloud over here. There are something like 127 islands. The Galapagos Conservancy says there's 230 some. And the park, the National Park of Galapagos, says 330. So I don't totally know who to believe. Most of them are just rocks that are barely poking their heads above the water. Some of them, as I said, are much bigger. This is Isabella, which is about 3/4 of the size of Prince Edward Island. So it's not an insignificant island. And part of the story of these islands is how unique they are, and their role in the whole story of these islands as a natural laboratory. And I'm going to be talking about that this time, and also we'll continue that conversation next week for those who are able to join. There are 5 islands that are inhabited by people, which may come as a surprise to some of you who have not been to the islands. Those who have been, I'm sure, realize that there are towns. And that's one of the things as well that I want to talk more about next time. Where do the people live, and how did the people get there, and what's the impact of people living in the islands? So this is a map of the islands, and it shows the 5 islands with inhabitants. The smallest one is Baltra, where probably most of you who have been to the islands probably flew into this airport. It's the biggest airport in the islands. I don't even know if there's really people living there full time. There might be a few. The biggest settlement is Puerto Ayora, which is here on Santa Cruz Island. And there are probably about 20,000 people-ish living in Puerto Ayora now, so not insignificant. The second largest one is over here on San Cristobal Island, Puerto Bacarino Moreno, where there's maybe 6,000 people living. The next smallest one is on the island of Isabella, where there are about 2,000 people or so. And then the smallest sort of permanent settlement is here on Floriana, and there's about 200 or 250 people living there permanently. One of the confusing things about traveling in the islands is that they all have multiple names. And so you can see some of the double names here. Some of them even have 3 names. Floriana is also called Charles or Santa Maria. So some of these are names that were given by English explorers, and some are the current official names, like Floriana is named after the first president of Ecuador, and Santa Maria is an older Spanish name. So it can make it slightly confusing. And I'm happy to talk to people about later, if we have time, to offer my opinions about the best ways to travel in the islands. And so when I started putting this talk together, I thought, well, I'd like to look at 4 questions, see if I can answer for you 4 questions. First of all, where did the islands come from? That's really in my wheelhouse because I am a geologist, and so I can talk a fair bit about the geology of the islands and how they formed. Second question is, how did the animals and plants get there? The third question, how did the people get there? And the fourth question, what is it like in the islands today? And so when I sat down to put these talks together, I just quickly discovered there's no way I'm covering all of this in 1 week. And so we reached the decision to split it. And so tonight I'd like to just look at where the islands come from and how did the plants and animals get there. And we'll also look a little bit at what happened to the animals and plants after they got there. And then next week, for those who are able to join, we'll look at how did the people get there and what is it like in the islands today. So first of all, where did the islands come from? And certainly those of you who've been down there will know this is a chain of volcanic islands. They're sitting out here in the Pacific Ocean about 1,000 kilometers offshore from Ecuador, which is right here, mainland Ecuador. And the islands are out here. They're sitting smack dab on the equator. So if you take a boat and travel through the islands, you'll probably cross through the equator, possibly more than once. So where did they come from? How did they get there? They are volcanoes poking their heads up above the level of the water. This picture over here is Volcan Wolf, which erupted most recently in 2015, and it was visible from boats just offshore. So Isabella, again, is that big one that's sort of shaped like a seahorse, the biggest island. And these are volcanic islands, oceanic volcanic islands that form over what's called a volcanic hotspot. So they're very much like Hawaii, or Tahiti also is another example. There's actually quite a few archipelagos that form in this way. And the way it works is that there is what's called a hotspot, shown right here, which is a plume of hot material that works its way all the way up from great depth, all the way probably down by the boundary between the mantle and the core of the Earth, working its way up here through the mantle, and then finally poking its way through the crust, which is the tectonic plate right here, and building a volcano on top of the hotspot where this magma is exiting. This volcano is being built here. And so the islands that are sitting right on the hotspot are the youngest islands, and they're the most volcanically active islands. In the case of the Galapagos, that is Isabella, which is that big one that's shaped like a seahorse, and Fernandina, which is the one just to the west of Isabella. So these are very young. They only started forming a few thousand years ago. And as you saw from the volcanic eruption of Wolf Island, or Wolf Volcano rather, they are still forming today. So meanwhile, what's going to happen is that this tectonic plate is going to keep moving. In this case, it's moving here from the Pacific Ocean side and moving towards South America. And it's going to carry this volcanic island with it off of the hotspot. And that's going to look like this. So it's taking this volcanic edifice and moving it right off the hotspot. This volcano is now going to become extinct, and a new volcano is going to form right on top of the hotspot. The tectonic plate is going to continue moving, in this case towards South America, and it's going to move that first island even farther off, and it's going to become eroded. And you see here that it's barely still poking its head up above the water, and a new young volcanically active island is going to form right over the hotspot. So what we find in these chains, these archipelagos, is that the islands that have been moved off the hotspot by the motion of this tectonic plate are going to be the older islands, and they're going to be inactive, they're extinct, they don't have anything feeding them from underneath anymore, and they're going to be eroded. So we have, in the Galapagos, we have Fernandina and Isabella that are sitting right on the hotspot. We have islands like San Cristobal that has been moved off of the hotspot. And then we have some even older ones that are between the Galapagos Islands and the mainland that are so eroded that they're not even poking their heads up above the level of the water anymore. So that's where the islands have come from. And for those who are interested in plate tectonics, this is the actual tectonic setting. Here's the location. This is Ecuador right here. The Galapagos Islands are about here. And we have here the whole big Pacific plate over here. And this is a smaller sort of fragment of a plate called the Nazca plate. And the Nazca plate is moving in this direction, where it is sort of colliding with the South American plate, forming the Andes. Meanwhile, the Galapagos Islands are located right here, right near this plate boundary with the Cocos plate, which you might think would be kind of a tectonically interesting and active location, and you would be right about that. It is, indeed. So here's where the hotspot is currently located, and what you can see under the water, so all of these bumpy areas, this is actually the seafloor, the topography of the seafloor. And you can see that there's this whole sort of chain of bumpy stuff. leading all the way in that direction from the hotspot towards South America. And that's again because the motion of the Nazca Plate has moved those active volcanoes off of the hotspot, and they have now eroded and they've become older and older. You might notice if you look really closely that there's something funny going on right here. You see right here, there's sort of another ridge of bumpy stuff leading from the hotspot, but in this direction. So what's actually going on there is that the motion of, this time, the Cocos Plate is actually moving volcanoes off of the Galapagos hotspot and moving them now in that direction. So it's actually another whole sort of branch, if you will, of the Galapagos Islands. So it is a very interesting and complex tectonic setting. And we're not even going to get into the Andes because that's a whole other ball of wax. So that's where the islands have come from, and the end result looks something like this. So again, this is our big seahorse-shaped island, which is Isabella. And this is the caldera of the largest island, largest volcano on the island, which is Sierra Negra. This is actually the second largest caldera in the world. It's pretty big. You can walk right up here. There's a path that goes right around the edge here, and you can actually walk all the way around to where the most recent eruption took place. This is a picture of Sierra Negra volcano erupting in 2018. When we actually went with the students in 2018, what year is this? So 29, and I guess again in 2019 when we went with the students, we were not able to walk all the way around the caldera because the volcano was actively erupting at the time. And looking at this topographical image, you can really see that the island is composed of a whole series of volcanic centers that have kind of merged together. So this is the location of that hotspot that's feeding the active volcanoes on Fernandina and on Isabella. And all those other volcanoes, all those other islands are now extinct, and they've been moved off in this direction towards the mainland of Ecuador. So that's where the islands came from. Now let's have a quick look at where the animals and plants came from. How did they get there? And one of the things that we'll be considering as well is what happened to some of them after they got to the islands. So how did the animals and plants get there, and then what happened to them? So let's start by looking at some marine organisms that are very common in the islands. First, we have some rays. I'm pretty sure these are golden rays. A little bit hard to tell from this picture. Rays are possibly my favorite animal. I love them. They're actually cartilaginous fish, so they're kind of related to sharks. And the other thing that you can see a lot of in Galapagos, of course, is sharks. It's one of the best places in the world to see sharks. We've had occasions with the students where we've been snorkeling with over 50 sharks at one time at Kicker Rock in San Cristobal. Green sea turtles as well, very, very common. And of course, lots and lots of other marine organisms that are very common in the island. So how did these animals get there? Well, obviously they can swim. So they can swim freely. So these animals don't tend to be endemic. And I don't know if you know what endemic means, but it refers to organisms that occur only in that location. And there are, those of you who've been to the islands will know there are lots of endemic organisms in the islands, organisms that only occur in the Galapagos and nowhere else. These organisms that you see here are not among them. They like the islands and they hang out in the islands and they sometimes even prefer the islands, but they are found in other locations because they can come and go freely, and they have obviously swum there from somewhere else. So check, rays, sharks, fish, sea turtles, other types of marine organisms, they can swim. Let's have a look at marine mammals now. There's lots of marine mammals that are quite iconic of the islands. One, of course, is this guy. I mean, seriously, so cute. This is a Galapagos sea lion. There also are Galapagos fur seals, different organism altogether. Galapagos sea lions also are not endemic, although there are lots and lots of them around the islands, and they do prefer the islands, and they're pretty iconic. They're fairly closely related to California sea lions, a little bit different. I think that's probably a subspecies. And they hang around. This is on San Cristobal on the Malecon on the coast there, and they tend to come up on shore and sort of drape themselves on everything. We used to call them the grade 8 bullies because they would sort of come and drape themselves all over the kids' playground so the kids weren't able to play. Since this picture was taken, the town has put up fences, and the sea lions now stay on the other side of the fence, which really is probably better for them anyway. They are wild animals. This is a bridie whale. There's several types of whales that you can see pretty easily in the islands, and dolphins as well. Lots and lots of dolphins, several different species of dolphins. So how did these guys get to the islands? Well, they also can swim. So again, marine mammals, they can swim there. They've come from elsewhere. They may prefer the islands. They may like the islands a lot. They may be kind of iconic, but they can move around, and they typically are found in a little bit of a bigger range. So they're not completely endemic to the islands. How about the birds? All of these birds that you see here are really iconic. They're really birds that when we see these birds, we think about the islands. So waved albatross, for example, their preferred nesting place is on Hispaniola Island in the Galapagos Islands. But these are champion long-distance swimmers. I mean, sorry, not swimmers, long-distance flyers. They can go really far. In fact, when juvenile waved albatrosses finally take to the air, they will stay in the air for as much as 2 years before returning to mate on Hispaniola Island. But again, they can come and go. They can fly easily, and they're not restricted only to the islands, although this particular species does prefer the islands, and their preferred mating area is on Hispaniola Island. Flamingos also are famous long-distance flyers. They can fly really far, and they also are pretty common in some locations in the islands, but not endemic. Frigate birds, another species that's very, very iconic of the islands. Those of you who've been to the islands, 100% for sure, you saw frigate birds. This is a mating pair. This is the female. This is the male. The males have these gular sacs that they blow up with air like this, and they are bright red. And when they're trying to attract a mate, and they fly around, and honestly, you want to say, buddy, how can you even fly with this thing? They're like the size of the bird's body itself, and they're flopping around and flying with these things, and that's how they're attracting their mate. Again, really iconic and very easy to see in the islands, not endemic. And then we have, of course, blue-footed boobies. Best feet in the animal kingdom. They're just terrific, not endemic to the islands. They are very emblematic of the islands, and for sure, 100%, those of you who've been there saw blue-footed boobies. You might have seen some of the other species of boobies, red-footed boobies or Nazca boobies. They're not endemic. This also is a mating feature, by the way, of blue-footed boobies. The males have these bright blue feet, and when it's mating season, they come around and they go like this with their feet, and they show the females their feet, and the females then choose their mate on the basis of who has the bluer feet, because the blue feet indicate that they have good nutrition. So back to our checklist: boobies, albatross, flamingos, frigates, and all these other marine birds, they can fly. So that's how they got there. Again, they don't tend to be endemic, even though a lot of them do prefer the islands. Now, what about these guys? These guys are a little bit more problematic. They don't fly. They can swim really well. They're very fast. They like to harass fish and other animals. It's actually kind of hilarious. They're very, very fast underwater, and if you're snorkeling, you can sort of see them harassing some of the other animals and chasing them and nipping at their tails. They like to harass the sea lions as well. But they're pretty small. So first of all, it might surprise you, those of you who've been to the islands probably knew this, but it might surprise you that there are penguins at all in the islands, because it's firmly on the equator, as I mentioned previously. What are penguins doing in the tropics? First of all, and secondly, they're pretty small. They're about maybe that big. It's the second smallest penguin species. There's one smaller one. And how did they get here from, say, Antarctica, where they probably originated from? Well, they probably just rode a current all the way up from Antarctica, and they probably hitched a ride on the Peru current, also called the Humboldt current. So this is a very cold current that comes up from Antarctica along the coast of South America. Very cold, very nutrient-rich water that feeds all these very lucrative fisheries all along the coast of South America, and then ends up here in the Galapagos Islands, actually ends up turning this way. And these animals are very, very dependent on that cold water. So when the water warms too much, for example, during an El Nino event, they suffer a lot. They suffer a lot of morbidity and mortality, and it takes them sometimes years to bounce back because they really need that cold water. So back to our checklist, how did the penguins get there? They came a little bit differently from the others. They were probably carried there by cold ocean currents. Now, what about these guys? These guys are problematic as well. This one right here is a bird, is a marine bird, marine organism. It is a flightless cormorant. And the operative word here is that it's flightless. This is called a Galapagos, the other name of it is a Galapagos cormorant. He looks maybe not so great, like his wings look like they might be in a little bit of trouble. No, this guy is in perfectly good health. This is what he's supposed to look like. And this is a bird that something happened to him after he got to the islands, and he actually lost the ability to fly. So he has adapted to the environment that he encountered when he and his cohorts, when he arrived in the island. So presumably an ancestral species flew to the island. There are other cormorants that are not flightless. The ancestral species flew to the islands, liked it, decided to stay, adapted to the environment, and decided that, well, they didn't decide, but did not need the ability to fly anymore, and they actually evolved to have lost the ability to fly. So this guy is endemic to Galapagos. Even though his ancestor flew here, this species has evolved to the point where it doesn't exist anywhere else. This one also is a little bit problematic. This is a small tree finch, and this animal is only about this big, pretty small. I can't totally see this organism flying 1,000 kilometers from the mainland. Maybe, it could be possible, but a further problem is that this species only occurs in the Galapagos Islands. And in fact, there are 13 or 14 species of finches that only occur in the Galapagos Islands. So clearly, again, an ancestral species to this finch arrived in the islands somehow, and then adapted to the environment, adapted to very specialized environments in the islands, and evolved into separate species that don't occur anywhere else. So back to our checklist, we're getting into some more problematic stories now, the flightless birds and these small land-based birds. We didn't have a problem with the marine birds, but the small land-based birds like finches and mockingbirds, how did they get there? We might need a different part of a story here to explain them. Now we get into some that are even more problematic and also very, very iconic of the islands. This is a Galapagos land iguana. It's a freshwater iguana. How in the blazes did this guy get here? It's a freshwater organism. There is no way, he didn't fly, he wasn't carried by an ocean current, it wouldn't have survived the salt water. So how did this organism, this freshwater organism, arrive in the islands? And of course we have the Galapagos tortoises, numerous species, the number of species is up for grabs at this point, that are, again, endemic to the islands. They don't occur anywhere else. This is a freshwater organism. How did they get here? Those of you who went to the islands a while ago, before 2012 or 2013, may have had the opportunity to visit Lonesome George, also called El Solitario Jorge. He died in either 2013 or 2012, I forget exactly, 1 week after we were there this is at the Charles Darwin Foundation research station on Santa Cruz. And 1 week after we were there visiting him with our students, he died, the last of his species. And this has been a very interesting story because, first of all, it was very impactful for our students, as you can imagine, to see the last of a species. So a species has gone extinct, and they saw the last individual of that species before he died. But Lonesome George was a very charismatic organism who gained a lot of attention for the Galapagos Conservancy and the Charles Darwin Foundation and the islands in general, and they weren't completely ready to let him go. So there have been sort of two parts to Lonesome George's story since then. One part is that they've done a lot of work to try to find others of his species elsewhere in the islands, and they may have found some hybrids, but have not found a pure member of his species yet. And the other thing that happened to Lonesome George is that he was sent to France after he died. At great expense, he was sent to France and stuffed. And so you now can go and visit Lonesome George again in the Charles Darwin station on Santa Cruz, and here he is, stuffed in all his glory. So back to our checklist. Tortoises, land iguanas, and other terrestrial animals. Again, we've got a bit of a problem. How did those organisms manage to arrive on the islands? They depend on fresh water. And now we have a real problem. This is the Galapagos marine iguana, absolutely iconic of the islands, also endemic. This is an iguana, which is normally a freshwater organism, but this organism is adapted to saltwater. So what happened to this animal? How did it get here? And what happened to it after it arrived in the islands? And so you can see here an adult organism. They tend to hang out in big batches like this all over the rocks and piling up on top of each other because, like other iguanas, they need to soak up the heat of the sun in order to regulate their body temperature. But the other challenge that this organism faced upon arriving in the islands was salt. There's not a lot of fresh water in the islands. We'll actually talk about that a bit next week because that has proven to be a challenge for people as well. So this organism had to find a way to adapt to the salt and be able to find its food, which is a marine algae. It has to dive, and then it sort of nibbles the algae off of the sides of the rocks underwater. And it has actually evolved a mechanism for being able to deal with the salt, which is a gland. And more or less, when you see them after they've climbed out of the water and they've had their algae dinner and they're sitting on the rocks and they're warming themselves, they basically expel the salt, more or less kind of like a sneeze, out of their nose, like this. And half the time it kind of blows back and lands on their head. So they look like they're wearing a white cap made out of salt. So that's a very, very specialized innovation and a very special adaptation that these organisms underwent after arriving in the islands. And I just had to show you this picture that I took when I was in the islands in 2016, which was in the midst of a fairly major El Nino. Marine iguanas also are very much hit by El Ninos because the water gets warm and the algae that they depend on is too deep for them to dive down to get to the cold water. So they die in droves, lots and lots. So this was an enormous pile of both dead and live marine organisms. Don't worry too much about them because unlike the penguins, they reproduce like mad and they bounce back very quickly. And this was actually a Sally Lightfoot crab who was chowing down on dead marine iguanas. So back to our checklist, marine iguanas, again, a bit of a question mark. How did this freshwater organism get there and what happened to it after it arrived in the islands? And finally, let's have a quick look at plants because plants are also an interesting story. Terrestrial plants obviously rely on fresh water. And these species also are endemic to the islands. They occur nowhere else. The lava cactus. So you can imagine, plants, maybe their seeds could be blown by the wind, or maybe their seeds could be eaten by birds and carried out there. And I'm not 100% convinced that that's the story for cacti. This is a species, possibly a subspecies of prickly pear opuntia cactus, which also is endemic to the islands. These grow to be quite tall, and they actually have co-evolved with the tortoises. So on the islands where the tortoises can raise their heads up really high, the opuntia cacti grow really tall as well to get out of the way. And this also is a species lantana. Those of you who are gardeners will be familiar with lantana. This is one of the few flowering species. There's very few flowers on the island, and there are almost no colored flowers on the islands. So this Lantana peduncularis is endemic to the islands. It occurs nowhere else. But this species of lantana is not endemic. It occurs in lots of different places. How in the heck did that one get there? This one has a completely different story, and it, of course, was brought in by people as an ornamental plant. So back to our checklist, terrestrial plants, maybe wind, maybe carried by birds. More recently, we know that some of them definitely were brought by people. But the big story that we haven't talked about yet is floating. And this is the actual setup in the Galapagos Islands. This is Ecuador right here. And here's our Humboldt Current, that cold current coming up from South America and turning past the islands right here. And if you go to Guayaquil, which is right about here, and go down to the river, walk along the river, it will look like this. And you'll see these big rafts of vegetation floating. They're actually cruising by at pretty high speeds. And they go down the river and out into the ocean, and they end up right in the Humboldt Current, where they are carried straight out to the islands. These are not insignificant. I tried to find a picture that I took when I was there in 2016. I couldn't find the picture. When we were there, we saw really big, these are not just a few twigs or a few bits of plant. We saw one of these floating rafts go by with a dead cow on it. So these are significant floating vegetation rafts, and they could easily host a whole little ecosystem. And you can see that they make their way out here, and they're going to get picked up by these currents. And that is thought to be the way that most of the terrestrial organisms, the tortoises, the iguanas, and probably even some of the smaller birds and the land plants, how their ancestral species arrived in the islands. So what's the result of all this? Like, they've all made their way to the islands, particularly the terrestrial organisms. They've all come by different means. Some of them arrived and then went extinct, the unsuccessful immigrants. Others arrived and then became adapted to very special conditions in the islands. And the result of all of this is what's called a disharmonic biota. A disharmonic biota is a biota, a group of organisms, where the proportions of the organisms, the proportions of their taxonomic groups, are skewed compared to the mainland. So what do I mean by that? Some groups are missing altogether. So missing from the Galapagos Islands almost completely are mammals. There are none. Now, there are mammals in the islands now. There are goats, rats, dogs, cats, donkeys, cows. I could go on. Where do you think those mammals came from? They didn't float out on a raft. They were brought by people. But there are almost no terrestrial mammals in the island. There is one bat species, and I think that might be the only terrestrial mammal in the islands. So that's way off from what we would see normally on the mainland. Amphibians, missing altogether. Colorful flowers, and therefore pollinators. There are very few pollinators in the islands. Freshwater fish, completely missing. How would they make it out to the islands, right? And insects as well. Many types of insects are just not represented. Butterflies, for example, just basically not represented in the islands. So this disharmonic biota actually turns out to be typical of islands, especially if they're islands like the Galapagos that were never connected to the mainland. And the other thing that we find, I forgot to mention, is that not only are some of the groups missing, but some groups and some organisms dominate that normally wouldn't. For example, in the Galapagos Islands, what do you think is the top predator? There's no mammals, so it's not, lions or something like that. It's actually this guy, Galapagos hawk. This is a small hawk. They're about maybe that big, and he is the top predator in the islands. So, there's some odd things going on, and this oddness, this disharmony, is accentuated by adaptive radiation. And what I mean by that is that a few founder species make it to the islands, and then they evolve after they get to the islands by adapting to these very specialized environmental conditions on isolated islands. So the end result of this is that island species tend to have certain characteristics. And if you are familiar with Hawaii and other places that are islands in the middle of the ocean, you'll recognize that some of these also are true of those islands. There tend to be lots of species and subspecies, but fewer of the higher taxonomic groups, like there aren't any mammals, but there's lots and lots of finches, 13 or 14 species of them. We tend to have a lot of endemism. So again, species that occur only in that location and nowhere else. We also tend to have what's called relictualism, which is sort of like the living fossil idea, where you had an ancestral species that made it to the island and then went extinct on the mainland. So now only exists on the island. The organisms on islands also tend to have very unusual traits and innovations, like our salt gland in the marine iguana and things like that. Oh, organisms occupying unusual niches. For example, I mentioned that there aren't very many pollinators. This very large moth is actually one of the biggest pollinators in the islands because there's no colorful flowers, there's no or very few butterflies, hummingbirds. I don't think there are any in the islands that I can think of. So different organisms step into those niches. There also tend to be size extremes, like the very large size of the Galapagos tortoises. There also tends to be vulnerability to imported and alien species. The species on islands are so specialized that if you import species, they can very, very easily take over. And we're going to be talking about that next week. Island species also tend to evolve a lack of dispersal capacity, which basically means they make it to the island and then they settle in and they don't go anywhere else. So there's our flightless cormorant. He arrived in the islands. He was like, yeah, I'm done. I'm just going to stay here. I don't need to fly anymore. I mean, it's always a mistake to anthropomorphize organisms. They don't decide how they're going to evolve, but that was the end result. And then there also tends to be a lack of predators. This is one reason why in the islands you'll find that many of the birds have nests that are either very low or actually on the ground because they don't have any natural predators. And so the end result of this in the Galapagos is, for example, the evolution of these 13 or 14 different species of finches. Now, the finches on Galapagos, they're very famous. They're called Darwin's finches. That's kind of a misnomer because Darwin actually was not inspired by the finches. That's a myth. Not only was he not inspired by the finches, he didn't collect very many of them, and he misidentified them. He actually didn't even realize that all these different types of birds were finches. He misidentified most of them. He did bring some back, and it gave some things to study later on, but he actually turned out to be more inspired by the mockingbirds in the islands. So how did we end up with all those species of finches? Again, an ancestral finch made it there somehow from the mainland. It's a relict. Its ancestor the original bird doesn't exist anymore on the mainland. And each of these birds managed to make it to one of the nearby islands. And so basically, virtually every single one of the major islands, and in some cases, individual volcanoes on individual islands, have their own species of finches that are very specifically adapted to those islands. So, as I mentioned, Darwin visited the islands in 1832, right at the time that they were being officially adopted by the country of Ecuador. And as shown in this picture from a PBS movie, and as shown here, there are 4 species of mockingbird in the islands. So the mockingbirds underwent a similar thing where an ancestral species made it to the islands, and then they underwent this adaptive radiation where they spread out to different islands. That's shown by the different colors on here. So the green is one species, the red, the orange, and the blue on different islands. And in this case, Darwin did correctly identify the mockingbirds. He did collect different species. And this was the thing that really got Darwin thinking. Why would God bring this mockingbird here and then change it just to put one on one island and another one on another island? And it bothered him. And this was one of the first things that really inspired him to develop his theory of evolution. So Darwin is a big, big presence in the islands. Any of you who've been to the islands will know that. And what I propose to do next week is to switch over to our other two questions and talk about, okay, how did the people get there? I'm going to do a whirlwind tour of the history of human habitation of the islands, ending up with some of the stories about some of the big issues in the islands today, part of which includes the impact of people, well, most of which includes the impact of people in the islands. So just to give you a little bit of a preview, if you are able to join next week, I'll start with indigenous presence, so pre-colonial indigenous presence. There is no evidence of it in the islands at all, even though people have looked for it really, really, really hard. Some of you know the story about Thor Heyerdahl in the 40s. He made this raft and showed that it would have been possible for pre-colonial indigenous people to make it to the islands, but there still is no actual evidence that they did. If you've been to Floriana Island, you probably saw this guy, and it's possible that your guide might have told you that this is evidence of an indigenous presence, but this was actually carved by European settlers on Floriana in the 1940s, so a little bit more recent. And we'll look at the various settlements in the islands today. And then I want also next week to talk a little bit about, as I said, some of the impacts of the presence of people in the islands. And I'd like specifically to spend some time with you talking about the impacts of invasive species, some of which you see here. So that's pretty much it for me. I think I'm 1 minute ahead of when you told me to stop, Rashid. How's that?
That was fantastic, and spot on with timing. I will say for the people who are watching on Facebook today, our apologies. We did have a lot of spam comments come through, despite the fact that we had set our commenting filters to try to prevent that. But a number of spam comments did come through, and we made a note not to click on any links in the comment section, and we've had to limit the number of comments that even legitimate people are able to post. So we're going to rely on our Zoom audience right now for questions. So if you do have questions, you're watching us on Zoom, please drop them into the Q&A panel. We'll get to them now as Barbara has a little bit of time. First, just a comment from one of our participants here. A great presentation, thank you. So that's from Wanda. Thanks so much for that compliment, well-earned compliment for Barbara tonight. And again, any questions that you may have, please drop them into the Q&A panel right now. We'll have a look back at our Facebook page very briefly. Just one person commenting that the presentation was amazing, and she hasn't been back to the Galapagos Islands in about 21 years. So I'm going to guess a lot has changed in that time. And yeah. I guess a question for you, Barbara, in that in the times that you've been, back to the islands, like what kind of changes have you noticed from one trip to the other?
I've been going now for 11 or 12 years, as I said, and I've noticed a lot of changes. We're very plugged into the governance and the management of the islands through our university partners, many of whom have done the foundational research on various topics in the islands, including the impacts of tourism and the impacts of invasive species and the management of the marine reserve and stuff like that. So we've seen a lot of changes over the years. The government of Ecuador has clamped down on immigration, so it's virtually impossible now to actually move to Galapagos. You have to marry a Galapaganian. That's pretty much the only way to do it. You can buy property, but you can't build anything on it, and it won't allow you to move to the islands. So they're, at the same time, they are pumping up the tourist presence, obviously not right now, And that'll be a big question because the COVID has been really impactful in the islands. I hate to tell you. So that, everything has changed now. But prior to that, the government of Ecuador was kind of milking the cash cow, and they were really pumping up the tourist presence. Um, but managing it pretty well. The park is in charge of managing tourism. And for example, when we first started going, if you were in a place here at Bartolome, for example, and you were having a good time, you could say to your guides, let's stay another couple of hours, and that would be okay 10, 12 years ago. No, it's not okay now. It's very restricted. And you have to arrive at a certain time, you have to leave at a certain time so the other group can come in. It's very structured, it's very restricted, but at the same time, that's what lets us, be the only two boats. Like in this case, you see two boats here at Bartolome. They're probably the only two boats there because it's very restricted and very closely monitored. So it has become more restricted, but at the same time, that preserves it for everybody's enjoyment, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that does answer one of the questions that we had come in to talk about the difference approaching travel as a tourist or someone who has more of a natural interest. And I guess, are there any
Well,
tours that you know of that you would recommend or that would start up again once the COVID restrictions have eased off?
yeah, so I mean, I have pretty strong opinions about tourism in the islands, but I mean, it's a big discussion, and we can carry on and talk about it afterwards if anybody is interested. But I'm in favor of boat-based tourism. We are land-based. The reason that we are land-based is that our university partner, which has a campus in Galapagos, is interested in supporting the local community. We also can't afford to bring the students down there boat-based, to be perfectly honest. That would cost way too much for our students. But being boat based, so you're not looking at your Disney cruises. Okay, these are not boats that have 2,000, 4,000 people. The biggest boats in the islands have about 200 passengers, and those aren't even that common, to be honest. A lot of them are smaller. Some of the ones here are probably more like 30, 16 people, something like that. You are way more mobile when you're on a boat. You can go to much more remote locations because you go to sleep and then they move the boat and you wake up in a whole new location. I think land-based tourism has some things going for it, but it does tend to be a little more impactful on things like waste management and stuff like that in the islands. So all things considered, I'm not really a cruise type person or a package tour type person. I've been on packaged cruises as a resource person in the islands. I'm in favor. It's you can't go anywhere on your own anyway in the islands. 97% of the land area is national park, and you're not allowed to go there without a guide. So, you kind of like you might as well just do the groundwork of picking a tour that's going to the places that you want to go to and then let them take care of it. And some of them are really, really well managed. So that would be my recommendation. I'm happy to talk to anybody about that.
And so when, we live in hopefully a post-COVID world, when would be the best time of the year to visit?
It's pretty much the same all year. It's on the equator. The water gets a little bit colder around sort of like our fall, so sort of like October, November, December, January. The water can be colder, so you might want to bring a wetsuit. But to be perfectly honest, I wear a wetsuit in June when I'm there because the water can be kind of cold. So, you know, I would say it doesn't really matter. Any time of year is good. Yep.
Another question, is there an active scientific research facility in the Galapagos?
Yep. So our university partner has a campus it's called the Galapagos Science Center. It's Universidad San Francisco de Quito is the name of the university. The campus is on San Cristobal Island, and they maintain a presence. They run some of the training programs for the guides, and they also carry out a lot of research, both their own researchers, but also researchers from all over the world, mostly Canada and the United States, who work through them. And then there also is, of course, the Charles Darwin Research Station, which was established in 1959. They are the other, I would say, big player in terms of kind of, administering, if you will, research programs in the islands. They are located on Santa Cruz. That's where the Lonesome George tech stuffed thing is. The Galapagos National Park, however, is the institution that issues researcher permits. So that's how it's all sort of managed. But yes, there's lots of active research in the islands.
A biology question for you. Question coming in from William Atlanta. Hi, how long do flamingos live?
Gosh, no clue. But when I was there in 2016, that was the year that I was on the cruise. So cruise, it was 100 and some people, so it wasn't huge, but it was very well managed. And we got to go to some really remote locations, way more remote. We went all the way around the top of Isabella Island, where I had never been when we go land-based with the students. There's no roads, so you couldn't get up there by land. So we went on the boat all the way around the top and stopped in some pretty remote places. And we saw flamingos with babies, and they're the cutest thing on the planet. They're like those tribbles or whatever they're called in that Star Wars episode, those little fuzzy round creatures that go around like this. They're like little round fuzzballs. So the true answer is I don't know, but they're cool organisms, man. They get their color because they eat brine shrimp, and that's what gives them that pink color. That's all I know about flamingos. I'm not really a bird person, to be perfectly honest. I didn't even like birds that much until I started going to Ecuador. The birds, I'm telling you, if you're a birder, you need to go to Ecuador. And really, you need to go to Galapagos. But the mainland, also, the cloud forest, you need to go. You absolutely need to go. And I'm a bird person now because I can actually identify most of the birds in the islands, which is kind of amazing for me.
That really would be, I think that's amazing for anyone. To be able to identify the variety of species that are there. We're running a little bit short on time right now, so we'll try to wrap up with kind of a 2-for-1 question here. Your favorite island / best island to visit?
I'm a huge fan. So that depends on whether you're talking about inhabited or uninhabited. Uninhabited, I would say Champion, which is little more than a rock. It's actually a volcanic cone that is. So the rock itself is sort of arc-shaped, and then it has water in the middle. And it's the most dramatic place that I've ever snorkeled, because you sort of come around a corner of the island, and then the wall of rock just falls away, and you get this feeling of the verticalness, the verticality of these ecological communities. It was just astonishing. So that's Champion. That's right next door to Floriana Island. But my favorite inhabited island, hands down, is Isabella. The town is just so peaceful. There's about 2,000 people. The streets are all unpaved, and you sort of pad around town with bare feet and go and have a drink on the beach, and it is super nice. Yep.
Excellent. We're going to have to leave it at that for tonight. Again, apologies to anyone who we couldn't quite get answers to, but I think we covered a lot of the bases that we had for today. And just a reminder that we will be continuing the presentation. And for people who may have tuned in a little bit late, you're welcome to join us next week, and we'll be able to pick up things kind of where we left off, and it'll be some fresh content for anyone who's tuning in. So a week from tonight, on February 16th at 7 p.m., we'll be doing our next Galapagos presentation. If you have registered for it in Zoom, great. You'll join the same way that you did today. If you have missed out on the registrations for Zoom because they did fill up very fast again, you will be able to watch the presentation live at facebook.com/yourriverwood. We'll be streaming the broadcast live on Facebook there as well. Hopefully we won't have as many spam problems as we did today, but we'll deal with that. But again, February 16th, 7 p.m. Eastern, either on Zoom or Facebook Live. And both of the presentations, once we have recordings of it, they'll be up on our YouTube page as well at youtube.com/yourriverwood. So Barbara Merck, a geologist and professor at the University of Toronto, thank you so much for your time today. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you again to Credit Valley Conservation for their support in making this webinar possible. And thank you for spending some of your time with us tonight. We do appreciate the support of people like you who care about nature, and your donations help us continue to offer programs like this. So if you're able, we would appreciate a contribution at theriverwoodconservancy.org. Thanks again for joining us today. Please stay safe, and we will see you again soon.